Tom, we're back here at the Program of Action Conference. It's supposed to be a review of everything the Program of Action has achieved. You don't hear anything about what it's achieved because really, what has it done? Nothing.
Well, the Program of Action has just been the kind of the foundation or the launching pad for the United Nations General Gun Control Program, as I call it. And it's allowed them to do what they do well, and that is slowly but surely have meetings and discuss things and institute programs all over the world, gun destruction programs, some marking programs, but it's just the basis of the structure. And this conference is moving at this time very, very slow. I don't think there's any doubt that they won't come up with something. The most significant thing that they'll come up with in my mind is that they're going to schedule meetings all the way out to 2018. So it goes on and on and on.
But just paint a picture of what it's like sitting in that room. I mean, and it's like going around in circles, but nothing really is achieved when they talk about, this is about stopping the illicit trade of arms. But you never really hear what the POA has done to do that.
You don't hear that much at all, but you will hear speech after speech after speech. And it's interesting because your audience has probably watched C-SPAN, they've watched the City Council, they've watched United States Congress, but watching the UN is quite unique because it's a series of irrelevant speeches, and the chair is always very weak, and at the end they come up with a report. The chair writes the report, or the chair writes the text, and then they'll comment on it some more. There'll be more speeches. It's very, very slow, unfocused process.
But I call the POA the blueprint for all of the UN's gun control programs. And even the supporters sitting in that room today will talk about, you know what, we really haven't been effective. They admit it.
Well, that's true, but at the same time, it has been a foundation. Now, last week, Hector Guerrera, the new IANSA head, or coordinator as they call him, said something very candid. He said that the POA has been the foundation of the UN's gun control effort, quote unquote. And that indeed is what it has been.
It's more of a vehicle, though, isn't it, for groups like IANSA to push their own agendas?
It is, and there's a difference between fighting illegal trafficking and gun control. We've known that for years at the NRA.
Well, their gun control is going after our guns.
That's right, and that's just the elimination of the number of, lowering the number of civilian firearms. The United Nations, and I made this in a statement last week, the United Nations has this disposition against civilian firearms. It doesn't like the concept of civilian firearms. Now, of all the firearms in the world, most of them are legally held by civilians. It's a fact that they just can't seem to swallow.
Ted Broman from the Heritage Foundation just wrote a commentary talking about how he was saying that the U.S. should pull out of the Program of Action. What is the realistic vision, you think, that would ever happen?
That's a good question, and it depends under what administration. The United States, going all the way back to when I started this effort in 1995, has always been a little bit dubious of the whole thing under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And it's a point that needs to be made, and that is that we are so different than the rest of the world that even Democratic administrations have been uncomfortable with the whole process, meeting after meeting after meeting. And this seems to go on and on and on.
And nothing is really done. And I hate to be so emphatic about it, but they really can't point to anything that they've done. Yeah, they collect guns from Africa and they burn them up, but we still see the massacres. We see what goes on in Syria. And you have to wonder, is it really effective?
That's true. In fact, we found out last week at one of the presentations that most of the guns seized in Africa, and there's a focus on Africa, most of those guns are AK-47s, full automatic AK-47s. And we've been saying for years, that's the real problem. Focus on these military guns that are being most of the time supplied by governments. Focus on that. Don't focus on civilian firearms. But let's make another point though. This goes. It's hard to put your finger on what they've done, this program or that program. Although their programs exist, but at the same time they like to change values. they call this sometimes a normative process, that they're going to change the values of the world, and there's something to that, because as long as this program goes on, no pun intended, they will have some impact on the values around the world. It's kind of part of the culture wars. In that sense, it's very disturbing, because it's very hard to get them to change their basic orientation.
So what are we going to see happen by the end of this week when things rack up?
Well, we'll see a report at the end of this week, and that report will contain, it may or may not contain ammunition as a subject matter. It may or may not contain the International Small Arms Control Standards.
Which is known as ISAC.
ISACs. It may or may not contain ISACs. But the most significant thing will be it will contain a recommendation to go on and on and on.
You mentioned ISACs, and that is a real controversial issue here. Last week we heard Richard Patterson from the industry side of things talking about how this has really been, and they pulled out of it, Sammy did, this has really been a program that too has been hijacked by groups like IANSA to push their own agendas.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about ISACs is it's a bureaucratically generated program. There is
voluntary, right?
Voluntary, but there is no real resolution to create ISACs. The United Nations Development Program in Geneva had some excess money. They put together this program and essentially decided we're going to generate these things. It's going to be the bureaucracy is going to generate these things. They brought in all these people to write these standards, what they call modules. They're extremely controversial. Some of them are extremely controversial, especially the module regarding civilian possession. They've withdrawn it. They were supposedly going to get input from industry, but they ignored that input. That is why SAMI, which is the American Civilian Arms Manufacturers, technically Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, are civilian arms manufacturers, why they withdrew from it.
And you made a point. Don't reject us. We, these NGOs, the pro-gun NGOs, are here for a reason. We're here to help you, but all you do is reject us and shut us out and then go behind closed doors.
That's correct, and we've said to them over the years, we're the ones that have the expertise in marking and tracing. We're the ones that have the expertise in gun safety. We're the ones that have realistic suggestions about import-export controls. For instance, we've been trying to get the United Nations for years to focus on standards for end-user certificates. There's end-user certificates are necessary when you ship perhaps arms from one country to the other for military use. And there are some end-user certificates involved in civilian shipments too. But we've said for years there should be standards, universal standards on what is a good end-user certificate. That would make commerce that much more efficient and that much easier for legitimate civilian commerce if we had those. They've never picked up on that.
Well, and you talk about being ineffective. This goes back to the days of John Bolton, when he was here, in 2001?
2001.
And drew the line in the sand and said, if it's not about our Second Amendment freedoms, if it's not about civilian ownership, then put it in writing. And they still have not done that, and you talked about it last week.
That's right, they won't put it in writing. And John Bolton, back in 2001, had the infamous red lines. One was that the program of action would not interfere with civilian possession. Another was it would not interfere with manufacturing. The one red line which they gave in on, was more meetings.
And more program of action stuff, and here we are.
And it goes on and on and on.